The Pacific is at threat of increased frequency and severity of extreme weather events fueled by climate change. At the same time, Pacific Island countries are rapidly urbanizing. Urban post-disaster recovery experiences globally have highlighted the need for approaches that are locally focused, multi-sectorial, people-centered, and high-participatory. Area-based approaches embody these criteria and are quickly gaining traction as an effective means of working with urban complexity and disaster resilience. In the midst of COVID-19 and multiple tropical cyclones across the Pacific, in-country researchers from Fiji, Vanuatu, and the Solomon Islands explored each country's urban response to disasters and the degree to which principles of ABAs are in place and utilized. So what is the current response?
So government has positioned themselves well to lead the assessment and response work with the support of civil society organizations, Red Cross, and some other locally based institutions. And civil society organizations are also working in close partnership with local government in doing assessments, response, recovery, including disaster preparedness work. Local humanitarian stakeholders they know the cultural and social context intimately. They had formed partnerships and closer working relationships with each other. Hence, they were confidently carrying out the assessments and planning response. International development agencies, including United Nations agencies that are based in Fiji, they worked through the government and the local society and the local civil society organizations to provide humanitarian support and resources. Also, the private sector, it was an interesting development we saw recently was the private sector through the Fiji Business Disaster Resilience Council. They were actively supporting government in procuring supplies for emergency and immediate response. This improved the response time and was seen by many stakeholders as an efficient process. We see more and more local-led humanitarian initiatives post-COVID-19 and Cyclone Harold.
We have heard it described as, one of the best responses to date. And in some measure, I would agree, and I'm referring to the TC Harold response. But we also need to acknowledge there were still significant humanitarian and medium-term gaps.
The current cluster system that coordinates all the clusters at the national level and have everybody, all the stakeholder partners, agencies coming together to respond to a disaster. So I think they're always referring back to the cluster system, that it's working well at the national level, and then from the national level it trickles down to the provincial and the community level. So that was they're probably weaknesses still there to strengthen, but everybody seems to be commenting more on the national cluster system that is currently set up and is in place and is managed by the National Disaster Management Office.
So overall, I would say that while the coordination is improved and there is a great localization of response, in disaster response, there are still issues with vulnerability and risk, and addressing some of these broader structural factors. Unregulated growth of the urban and peri-urban areas, the reliance of everyone on the informal economy rather than the formal economy. Inequality issues, particularly inclusion of women and people with disabilities and youth, and also centralization and sometimes misuse of funds in disaster response. These remain the broader issues that Solomon Islands still has to grapple with.
One of the challenges during this time was the lack of clarity on who can do what during the COVID-19 context. The institutional arrangements were confusing for many. There was no clear policy directive. And then there was coordination issues and challenges being experienced among government agencies and civil society organizations.
Particularly in urban areas where preposition relief supplies and standard approaches to coordination just didn't get the job done. As a result, needs of urban communities have gone largely unmet.
Communication would say at the national level to provincial level is okay, but there needs to be more strengthened at the community level. So when the information goes down to the community level, but it has to be like a feedback system where information that is collected at the community level is then referred back to whoever at the national or provincial level. So then the communities are able to receive whatever response that they have requested.
So with the process here, there's been a lot of learning from previous disasters where many agencies just came in and did what they wanted without coordinating, without checking that what they were going to do was really needed. So learning from those negative experiences now has led to collaboration and joint formulation of tools and a strategy to respond to disasters.
This is being empowered by the revision of outdated disaster management legislation, which is embedding the cluster system at national and subnational levels. This started as a global mechanism and is being adapted and grounded by many Pacific countries as a standing coordination mechanism, which the international community then supports.
Similar, people assume it's a blank slate rather than a place that has functioning systems and responses already in place. So it's great that this project and other projects now are pointing out that we should work with local strengths that are here rather than international people, particularly trying to impose new ideas from overseas.
So local partners, including both government and civil society organizations, expressed the need for locally led humanitarian responses. They wanted to take the lead. They wanted to have ownership of the design and support and lead the humanitarian response. Government and civil society organizations they were both looking for opportunities to continue building their capacity and access resources so they can carry out the disaster management work instead of having international partners lead this work. They felt very strongly that the work should be done by them, especially from the government. The response was very strong. They appreciated both civil society organizations and government. They appreciated the international engagement and support, but wanted that to be in the form of capacity and technical skills building, funding, and having access to other resources and networks so that they can be more efficient in response and leading humanitarian responses in Fiji.
So I think this is what we need to be moving towards is looking at resilience of food and economic systems that can sustain people over whatever crisis, and then within the crisis itself, looking at how local institutions can best respond to these diverse needs and issues that come up.
More participatory approach, like engage people who are impacted by the disaster, so then they can tell you what sort of impacts have they experienced, what do they need. Sometimes agencies just rush in and provide them with standard distribution, but they don't tend to involve the communities who are affected, so then they understand, okay, this is the specific needs that they want. Because sometimes when they give them the response, it's not what the community needs.
It's really important that we continue to acknowledge that it's the affected population that lead their own recovery process, and everyone else is external to this process, including the international humanitarian community, who are in fact the ones participating, I would argue.